What's up, nerds? Welcome to the UK Forces faction overview video. In this video, I'm going to talk about, well, as you can see, I got a tier list in front of me. We're going to break down all of the UK Forces units. We're going to break them into tiers as well as battle groups. We're going to overview the battle group abilities and structures as well. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk about map pool. This is going to be more specific to like 1v1. For those of you that are competitive, 1v1 maps probably matter more because you don't have the flexibility of having multiple factions to cover multiple, I guess, bases in terms of your unit composition. And at the same time, there's probably the most variety in terms of size and scope of maps in 1v1. So I'm going to focus the map discussion specifically on 1v1, but if you guys really want me to talk about other maps as well, I can do that, but I'm going to save that for a future video because we got a lot to go through on this one. So we're going to start with breaking down the units available to the UK forces by tier. And then I'm going to go a little bit deeper and we'll look at battle groups specifically, and then I'll break down the battle group structures and include abilities and some commentary about those. And like I said, at the end, we'll follow with maps. So starting out, looking at this tier list here, we're going to start with the UK Forces Infantry, then we'll move through the rest of the units as well. Infantry sections. Right now, infantry sections, very strong unit. Probably the best line infantry in the game, I would argue. They are very versatile. They have multiple weapon upgrades. They're the only unit in the game. I think they're the only unit in the game. Don't hold me to, well, maybe hold me to that. I think they might be the only unit in the game with a completely flat DPS curve. So what that looks like, I'm actually just going to pull it up for you guys so you can see it. The Tommies might be the only, they're actually called Tommies in this. By the way, this is a fantastic tool. If you guys don't know what this is, COH3stats.com, fantastic place for comparing unit stats. Let's just compare them to a simple Panzer Grenadier here. Tommies have, as you can see here, they have a almost completely flat DPS curve. Most of the other units, infantry units in the game, have a DPS curve that looks like this, where it's higher at short range and lower at long range, unsurprisingly. But as you can see, the Tommies are remarkably consistent at pretty much any range. They're doing virtually the same damage. And for that reason, you actually want to keep your distance, because you can see these are the distances where UK infantry have the advantage. The Tommies have the advantage. And then you can see below that, the Panzer Grenadiers start to become stronger. So the Tommies are strong. I'm not putting them in OP because, I mean, I think they would just have to punch way above their weight to be considered OP, and they're just not in that category. But they're probably the closest to OP that any line unit is in the game. The Recce option that they have, which offers the 2 scoped Lien fields, they provide extra accuracy against units in cover. These are great in team games where you are dealing with a lot of camoed units of your opponent. So if your opponent's playing DAC espionage battle group, terror battle group with a lot of cloaked MGs, or otherwise any other kind of cloak unit, I mean, Wehrmacht has lots of them, Jaegers, packs, you name it. Once they get Vet 1, they all have access to Cloak. And the Recce can be really nice for this, especially if you get like 3 of them, because you can just have a continuous set of flares that you're flying up over the battlefield before you make an advance on an area. So it's really, really great tool. Fantastic synergy with the Canadian battle group, specifically on the Recce's, because of I'm actually just going to pull it up here. If we look at offensive resupply as part of the shock assault tree on the Canadian shock battle group, this allows you to, upon neutralizing a point, is going to give your squads, I think it's about 45 seconds of reduced cost abilities. And this makes pretty much anything that your UK infantry can use, your Tommies can use, it makes that ability free. So that is including the Recce artillery. The 25-pounder base artillery is exceptional now after the buffs that it got last patch. I may actually showcase it at the end of this video because a lot of people were like, what the hell are you talking about? The base artillery is not that good. And I'm like, dude, you have to see it. It's excellent. It's excellent. But yeah, Recce has great synergy with offensive resupply. I really like this in team games, especially because you're neutralizing points a little bit less often. Attacking Spirit I find to be more useful in 1v1s, but anyway, I'm getting too deep. Let's go back to Tommies. Bren guns are easily the best single target damage option on a line infantry unit in the game. It makes Tommies scale incredibly well, and you stack training on top of that. I mean, if you get to the end of the game with a Bren section that's got training, he is in the OP category. He's jumped up a tier. Because they're super, super strong, super useful. And again, you want to use these guys at long range. The best way to use them is to make sure that they are parked in cover and getting their Vet 1 passive bonus. Very, very important for this squad. But yeah, in terms of cost effectiveness, trading capacity, like the Tommies do it the best compared to any line unit in the game. So very strong. Aussies, right up there next to them. If you guys haven't watched my How to Australian Defense Battle Group video, I just uploaded it, and I talk about the strength of this unit and how to use it. These guys are incredibly versatile, and you really have two options when you use them. You can either build them right from the jump of the game, or you can bring them in later on if you haven't committed to Australian defense right at the beginning of the game. And they are going to be useful and scale super well regardless of which of those two decisions you decide to make. One of the nice things... Close my door. One of the nice things about the Australian Lights is when they come on the field, these guys have a DPS curve that is much more akin to what you're used to seeing from riflemen. So I'll just put them side by side with the Tommies here so you guys can see. You can see the Aussies have the downward trending, much better at short range DPS curve. And then once you equip them with the Scopely Enfields, it becomes much more flat. Here you can see. And they actually become even stronger than, I mean, these are unupgraded, right? Here, if we want to be real, let's throw a Bren on these guys and then compare them. You can see Tommy's still, probably the best with the Bren. But the nice thing about the Scopely Enfields in the late game is they provide extra recon. The extra accuracy against units in cover is excellent. And essentially what you do with your Aussies is in the early game, you use them aggressively like riflemen. And then as the game progresses, it becomes more and more dangerous to use shock units and short range units because your opponents start to get vehicles out. There's more artillery on the field. And you just want to play more safely with your infantry because you're at risk of losing them if you close the gap on your opponent. And this is the perfect time for you to upgrade them with the scoped rifle package. And start laying down more Sangar walls, which is the special defensive structure that the Aussies have access to. And these guys just scale incredibly well. And they're also really, really strong with the snipe ability. So the Aussies is another great example of a unit that scales like right into the OP category as the game progresses. UKF Infantry, you'll see a trend here. Like categorically, they are very, very good. Very strong infantry. Scale probably the best in the game, especially with training. But yeah, enough about Aussies. These guys I can't say enough good things about. Go check out my video on how to play Australian Battle Group. They're very, very good. Canadians. These guys are new. I think in terms of where they stand in the Battle Group tree, a lot of, I'll be honest, I've talked to a lot of people that feel like they belong down here. And I just don't agree with that. I think when properly used, these guys are definitely in the strong category. I don't think they scale quite into the OP category as much as these two do, especially in the late game, but they are very beefy and they synergize fantastically with the rest of the Canadian Shock Battle Group. I have a game that I'm planning to do a video on eventually. It's a 2v2 game where I use a lot of these shock guys on Santorio. It's an urban map in combination with the Croc, and really just getting like the most out of that battle group that I'll likely share you guys in the coming weeks. But anyways, Canadians specifically. So these guys are a shock unit similar to Aussies, but they have more health. They're beefier. They have access to the light gammon bomb, which is the same that the guards have. This is the best grenade in the game. It's even better than the Panzer Grenadiers bundle grenade, just slightly, but it is better. And they have some great scaling with veterancy. The issue is really getting them there. They also have access to 2 weapon upgrades via the mortar, the 2-inch mortar, and the Piet. I have to say, since I've used these guys in the game, I'm mainly using them for the Piet. And the reason for that is, if I want really like long-range prowess and indirect fire options, I'm probably just going for like Tommies with a combination of either mortars or light artillery, like the Bishop. Where the hell's the Bishop? He's here somewhere. And if there's the Bishop. And, the Piet is easily the best handheld anti-tank option that the UK forces has, even better than the guards with their bazookas. It does great chunk damage. The real issue with the Piet is the aim time. These guys can be kited very well by fast vehicles if your opponent's paying attention and trying to keep you at max range. It can be very oppressive. And so using these guys in combination with the pressure of another light vehicle to support them is pretty important. So again, Canadians, I'm putting them in the strong category. Once these guys hit Vet 2 and start getting their 20% damage resistance and then some of their Vet 3 bonuses, they become pretty unstoppable. Like they're very difficult to stop by most Axis infantry at that point in the game. The exception maybe being vetted Wehrmacht Panzer Grenadiers, DAC Panzer Grenadiers. They also don't trade super well in the early game, but once they get to that Vet 2 marker and they start getting the damage reduction, you can be much more aggressive with them, which is really nice. So Canadians definitely going in the strong category. This is the LMG Commando, which I believe now is called something else. It's called like the Commando Officer or something like that. These guys, I'm putting them in average. I actually debated putting them in bad, but since they got some recent buffs to their accuracy at Vet 2, they actually do a fair deal of damage compared to pre-patch. They got a little bit left behind when the Relic did the big line unit buffs recently. Probably within, I guess that was in the last, like, I think it was 1.4, 1.5. I don't remember exactly. But these guys kind of got left behind during that patch, but recently they got some accuracy added back at Vet 2, which makes them pretty good. They have some nice utility with the Hawker strafing run and the on-the-field reinforcement. If you're using other commandos or even multiple squads of these guys, they could be pretty good on the front line. And with the ambush bonus, they actually are quite strong. The issue with them mainly is they're susceptible to light vehicles. They have no counters to light vehicles unless you happen to land a good Hawker run, and the fact that they're quite fragile because they're only a 4-man squad. And they're a little bit expensive to reinforce at 320 manpower. And I think it's 32 to reinforce if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, these guys, like, they're kind of outshined in terms of performance, like anti-infantry performance by Tommies, Aussies, and Gurkhas, which we'll talk about shortly. But overall, you know, I consider these guys to probably be average. Sappers. This is the best combat engineer unit in the game. They are expensive, so that definitely has an impact on, you know, considering how they are used. Great synergy with armored battle group with the engineered detachments option, which provides cheaper reinforcements and cheaper build costs on these guys. They can be very, I think it's really important to use multiple sappers, especially if you're playing on an urban map like Pacino, for example, or in areas where there's lots of buildings. And then, of course, the late game option that is adjacent to, where is it? That is adjacent to the Churchill, Demolition Engineering, makes these guys really strong. The damage resistance, you're playing on an urban map like Gazala Landing Strip, I think it's called. No, Gazala actually doesn't have any urban areas. But anyway, you get my point. On maps where there's lots of buildings, you're going to be playing in that area. These guys are a great option. And with all the Axis heavies, I'm going to be straight. Like, I've been going for Demolition Engineering more often than I've been going for the Churchill heavy croc. Because when you're coming up against Tigers or KTs, elephants, all that stuff, having a really slow vehicle is not really ideal. And it's difficult to support. I have a much better time playing with Demolition Engineering, going for Smoke Operation and Crusaders. Anyways, back to the infantry here. So Demolition Engineering makes these guys super strong, but they're good all throughout the game. I am almost always building at least one extra of these in 1v1, so I have two, one with a flamer and one with a hazard removal kit for repairs and minesweeping. These guys are strong. They would be OP if any engineers were OP. It would be these guys, I think. And I think since engineering detachments got nerfs, I wouldn't put them in the OP category either, but they are still very good. Commandos. These are the SMG short-range commando squad that cost 400 manpower as part of the Air and Sea battle group. I'm putting these guys in bad. It's just, these guys are really hard to get great value out of at the moment. And there's a couple reasons for that. Namely, I would say they're one of few squads that has access to ambush bonus, but can only use it in short range at the moment. If you're not engaging a CQC squad with ambush bonus, they actually don't perform very well, and they're really expensive. 400 manpower is like no joke for the cost on these guys. I would give them some credit with like their utility, but like the grenades, the Mills bombs that they get are pretty lackluster. I understand why they don't have a Gammon bomb, because using that from stealth would be probably busted, honestly. But I would like to see their demo kits get the same treatment that the SSF got for US Forces Spec Ops, where their demo kits are only detectable to units with sweepers. Since their demo kits are detectable to anything, it's much harder to place them and use them really effectively. Very micro-intensive unit. Like I said, it's super expensive. It's actually very hard to fit this into a composition with good vehicle timings with UKF. And like I mentioned, it's also very difficult to trigger the ambush bonus on them, because you want to get them into close range, but you also want to trigger the ambush bonus, which you can't do from too close because you'll get detected. So it becomes like a really difficult microgame to find the sweet spot of like when to attack with these guys from the camo in order to get the full ambush bonus. I would also like to see maybe like some buffs to their ambush, make it a little bit better, or make it last maybe a little bit longer. I think that would make this unit much more usable, but right now I don't really like using these guys. They're too expensive, they require too much attention, and you get very little value out of them over the course of the game. And I would say this is even especially true in a team game setting. The Vickers. Vickers, I'm putting an average for a machine gun. I mean, it does what it needs to do, essentially. The Vet 1 on it is very nice. It's very unique compared to the other Vet 1s on machine guns. It's a great way to force away opposing team weapons. You can use this against like the 20mm flak or other, opposition machine guns like the MG42, for example. But outside of that, it doesn't have exceptional suppression. The damage on it is solid. Suppression is probably the weak point on this unit. And I am building it in games where I'm running into a lot of blobs, but I'm not building it early. Unlike, maybe the 1919 for the USF or any of the MG variants for the Axis factions. But I am getting these occasionally as needed. They do the essential job that they need to do as a machine gun. And like I said, they do provide some decent team weapon harassment once you get access to that Vet 1. And at Vet 3, they're very good with the increased arc, which includes the increased arc on the Vet 1 ability, the focus gunnery, Vickers, decent MG all around. Next, we'll bring up Gurkhas. Gurkhas, I think, are a pretty highly underrated unit at the moment. I actually think these guys like border on OP, but honestly, if I were to be super fair, it would probably be more like Aussies are OP and Gurkhas not quite. But I am gonna put them in the strong category for now. These guys are probably the best anti-infantry unit next to Stostruppen in the game. In terms of just their pure line capabilities, they have very good veterancy. And I love weaving these guys into my standard opener for UKF when I'm playing 1v1s in many cases is 2 sappers, dingo, 2 sections. And I love to throw a Gurkha in if I'm playing Indian artillery to kind of round out my line infantry composition. Because the sections are usually pretty good, and then the Gurkhas really just like they add some extra oomph and firepower and pushing power into my infantry composition. So they're a great complement. The Bren gun is generally the best choice for these guys. Single target damage is very important in this game because with models in a squad comes the damage. And by having your damage concentrated onto one unit in the squad, you're actually going to chew through your opponent's DPS in their squads faster than trading evenly with just Lee Enfields or even Thompsons. Like the Thompson submachine gun, one of the weaknesses of it is that you'll do damage to several units at once instead of just one model at a time. And that's really the benefit of the Bren gun. But there are some maps that I am leaning into the Thompsons. Lots of CQC maps I'll use the Thompsons on, or if I'm using them for ambushes or trying to clear out important team weapons. These guys are great at it. They have an awesome Vet 1 ability, Io Gurkhali, that gives them speed and reduces accuracy of units around them. They also have access to a grenade assault and smoke. So all around, great anti-infantry unit. Obviously, they're very susceptible to vehicles. But overall, like the only unit that these guys can't stand up to eventually with training is Stostruppen from the Wehrmacht. But otherwise, they're going to beat pretty much everything else pretty handily. Next, we've got the UK Mortar. Putting the UK Mortar in bad. I don't know why, but I'm pretty sure the UK Mortar has worse scatter than the M1 Mortar for the United States. I don't really understand why that is, but this thing tends to miss targets quite a bit. The Vet 1 on it is decent, but I find myself, when I build this, it's more often than not for the use of the smoke rather than the damage from the mortar. And also, of course, I am going to use the mortar for dislodging units from buildings because I don't have to worry about missing so much with that. But in general, I'm not really trying to build the mortar. In situations where I might build the mortar in a team game, I'm usually just going to save for a bishop. Bishop is much, much better than the mortar in terms of light artillery. So, yeah. Mortar probably in the bad category as far as mortars go. Foot guards, Right now, I'm putting them in average. They're kind of mediocre at everything they do, but they do have a purpose. They absolutely have a purpose. They have strengths. The core strength of these guys, I mean, if you have access to Canadians, Canadians are just better at this. But the foot guards have access to the Vet 1 vehicle snare. This is perfect as an anti-dive tool and is complementary to like something like a 17 pounder, where if you're anticipating getting rushed by your opponent with some expensive vehicles, maybe Panthers, this unit is perfect to deal with those, because once they get Vet 1, they're able to kind of stun it, lock it in place for several seconds, and that sets up something like any of these AT guns to kind of finish the job on whatever target they're hitting. With infantry training, they are quite good at killing units in CQC. Their main issue is closing the gap, and of course, as they drop models, they keep the bazookas, which means like you only really have 4 units that are handling the Thompson submachine gun. And you lose DPS very rapidly if you're trying to approach. So these guys are best used on flanks, or honestly really defensively. If your opponent's trying to push into you, they can kind of hold the line, throw that light gammon bomb, and use their bazookas to keep back any opposing vehicles. But they are pretty expensive. The Canadians, I think, serve this purpose generally better than the guards do here. But the guards are still a great option for when you don't have access to those. Next up, we've got the Archer. Archer is, I think, in a pretty solid spot. It has a great identity as basically a mobile version of the 17 pounder with a turret. Definitely not going to put this in the OP category, but as far as team games go, I think this is strong. Having something with 60 range that is mobile and deals 240 damage is probably more important than it's ever been, with all of the Axis heavy vehicles now on the field and becoming more popular. And this is easily, one of the high points of the Australian Defence Battle Group. I actually use one in the game that I uploaded in my other video, so go check that out. I kind of talk a little bit more into the nuance of how to use it, how to position with it. But it's pretty straightforward. You really want to just be keeping your distance and making sure that you have vision around it at all times. You don't want to be exposing yourself to a potential flank, because that's when these things get cooked up pretty quickly. Thankfully, because of the cost reduction they got last patch, they're made quite a bit cheaper, which makes them much more accessible in terms of getting a couple of them out to deal with some of the Axis super heavies. So I really like the Archer. I think it's in a good spot. I put it in strong. The 17 pounder itself, I'm going to put it in average. Obviously, it does the same job as the Archer, but it's just immobile. This is deployed via truck. I'm putting it in average mostly because of just how susceptible it is to artillery, and there's lots of great Axis artillery right now. Makes these things super easy to decrew and kill, but I'm still using them a fair bit in team games. I had a team game not too long ago on one of the more open desert maps. I think it was actually Gazala Landing Strip, where I had 2 of these, and I was kind of just carting them back and forth with one medical truck. One of the things that people forget about building the 17 pounder, I want to make sure you guys know, is that it comes with the truck, and the truck that you build can be refit. So one of the nice things that you could do is you build actually 2 of these, and then you refit one of the trucks. So you have kind of one truck that takes care of both of them. And because you refit the truck, you actually get the majority of the cost of the unit back. And so I think it's like 360 manpower, 40 fuel. But after you refit the truck, it's like 200 manpower less and 20 fuel less. So it turns out to be, what is that? 160 manpower and 20 fuel for a second one of these if you refit the truck. It's quite good. So that's generally the circumstance in which I'm using these. And obviously, if I don't have access to the Archer or Prince or other forms of heavy AT that the Brits have access to, 17 pounder is always a great fallback choice. 2 pounder, here we go. We're breaking the ice on the OP category. This thing is an absolute menace. The Vet 1 ability on it, the target weak point that fires multiple shots, it always penetrates, it disables your opponent's weapons and reduces their speed. If you can stack up a couple of these things and disable your opponent's frontline vehicles, they're just so dangerous like that. This is the only unit in the game that has a multiple shot target weak point. And this can lead to like between 10 and 15 seconds of disables on the Axis vehicles, which are perfect for setting up follow-up from your allies' vehicles. I think these things get overlooked because they have a low penetration rate, which is true until you get Vet 1. And as long as you're popping Vet 1, you're always going to deal damage. You're always going to penetrate whatever target you're hitting. And that is the whole reason these things are in the OP category. Some other benefits of the 2-pounder, it has a faster setup time than other standard AT guns. Standard AT guns have 2.5 second setup. This thing has a 2-second setup. It has a little bit of a wider arc. It has a faster rate of fire. The net damage or the DPS is the same on the 2-pounder and the 6-pounder. But the 6-pounder does more damage per shot, does 160. The 2-pounder does 120, but the 120 is firing more often. Sorry, the 2-pounder is firing more often. So it works out to be almost exactly the same DPS. But yeah, the Vet 1, highly slept on in this thing. These things are super useful at every stage of the game as long as you have the Vet 1. And if you happen to lose them or, you know, they get decrewed or whatever, just getting light, what is it called, team weapon training in the late game will get these things back to Vet 1 very quickly, and you can keep the utility on them up. And again, it's also very cheap. It's like 30 munitions, I think, to use the target weak point on this, so very, very good. 6-pounder, it's a very average AT gun, nothing special about it. As far as AT guns go, you know, it does what it's expected to. I'm not going to say too much about this because all the AT guns are pretty similar. The Vet 1 entrenchment ability is pretty good on it. But yeah, I mean, this is your essential mid-game AT piece. Building 1 or 2 of these is usually pretty essential unless you have access to another form of anti-tank. Yeah, it does the job pretty well. It's got good penetration. And like I said, the Vet 1 on it is pretty nice. If you manage to get a good position on it, the extra rate of fire can mean the difference between killing an enemy vehicle and a near miss or near finish, I guess. The Bishop. Bishop is not quite in the OP category, but it is a very strong artillery piece. This is probably the second best light artillery in the game next to the Nebelwerfer. Or not the Nebelwerfer, sorry. The Dak Stuka. The Dak Stuka is in the OP category. It is the best a mobile artillery unit in the game. But the Bishop is a close second. In pairs, these things are absolutely devastating if you can hit an enemy defensive position. I always recommend hitting the same or close to the same position with Bishops. Oftentimes what I'm doing is if I'm firing at infantry, I'll fire like in 2 places that are very close to each other so I can pick up units as they're retreating out of the first barrage, maybe into the second. Excuse me. Once you're hitting like 2 shots in a row on a squad, that's when you really start to drop the models, which is why getting at least 2 of these is pretty important if you're planning to purchase the side tech into them. That is the main drawback of the Bishop at the moment, is having to pay for the side tech. But as long as you're getting 2 of these things, it's usually worth it. The other drawback is obviously that's going to slow down your tier 4 vehicles, but as long as you anchor well with strong infantry and adequate AT support, you should be able to manage and get to your tier 4 vehicles anyways. So the Bishop is strong. Centaur. Centaur is not in a good position. I just don't think this thing really has a great identity, considering it's now been moved to tier 4. Any situation I feel like I would like a Centaur, I would probably rather have a Crusader. Honestly, Crusader is just, it's faster. I have the ability to upgrade the gun on it. I can deal more meaningful damage to vehicles than the Centaur can. I guess, you know, it has a place in that it kind of fits in the anti-infantry category. in between the Crusader and the Churchill, because it has a little bit, or the Crusader and the Matilda, I should say, because it's still decently fast, but not quite as heavily armored as the Matilda or the Churchill. But again, I just don't think this really has a great identity in the current meta. It doesn't really fit anywhere that I wouldn't rather have another vehicle, and it's still reasonably expensive. So for that reason, I'm putting it in the bad category. The Churchill. Churchill, I'm hesitating to put it in bad. I think I would put it in average at the moment. The reason being, this was strong last patch. But with all of the changes to anti-tank weapons, all of the new super heavies on the field, DAC having lots of access to AT tools, this thing is just really difficult to use effectively at the moment. I don't love the new Vet 1 on it. It's okay. Like, having uptime on the Churchill is really nice. But until you get a couple of these, like, they're really hard to like get a lot of great usage out of. But these things are just like, they're just damage sinks, Generally, when you're playing with the Churchill, you're going to want to be backing it up with some AT guns, maybe like a double 6-pounder sort of situation, to handle any armored threats to the Churchills. But these are great infantry tanks. They take a lot of damage. They have access to the deployable smoke behind to cover infantry, and they deal great damage to infantry. These things will stand up to mediums for the most part, but once those Panthers and Tigers and the heavier variants start rolling out, these guys kind of start to struggle. They're good in mass in team games, like if you get 2 or 3 of them together, along with the vehicle repair stations. The uptime on them can be very good. You're just kind of continuously applying pressure, soaking damage. But they are quite susceptible because of how slow they are to big pushes. And especially with the new adjustment to vehicle damage from the rear, it can make them susceptible to big flanks from like swarms of P3s or P4s or what have you. And so for that reason, I'm putting them in the average category rather than strong. The Prince. The Prince is going up in strong. It's in a really solid place now. Last patch, the main weaknesses of it were its speed and its rate of fire. Surprisingly, it kind of struggled against some of the heavier Axis variants because of the slow rate of fire that it had. In this most recent patch, they increased the reload speed and they made it immune to crew shock criticals, which is great. It also was given additional side armor to make it stronger against some of the handheld options and other anti-tank weapons. So the Prince is all in all like in a very good spot. Previously, I was actually opting for the Churchill more often, but I think now with the buffs to the Prince, and with it being more anti-vehicle focused, and you could be much more aggressive with it, it's more forgiving because it's immune to the crew shocks. It's not getting caught out and destroyed quite as easily. And also with the nerfs to the loiters, that really benefited this thing as well, because it would get chewed up by loiters because of how slow it is. So overall, Prince is in a pretty good spot. The buffs in the last patch definitely helped it out. And this is a great anchor vehicle to kind of round out the end of the armored battle group tree for UKF. Speaking of Armored Battle Group tree, we had the AA Crusader get moved into Tier 4 away from a call-in. I was actually really happy about this. I feel kind of similarly to the way that I do about the Centaur, but I actually think this is a little bit better. It did get some decent buffs to compensate for the tech structure movement, and it's a really effective anti-infantry vehicle now. Definitely more dependable and reliable than the Crusader and the what the hell is it called? The Grant, even the Matilda. And it retains the awesome mobility of the Crusader chassis, and it also obviously has some great anti-air capabilities as well. The main issue with this thing now is the timing. Because it's coming out of the UK's tier. I was going to say tier 4. It's actually tier 3. Because this is coming out of the endgame tech structure, oftentimes your opponent is going to have other vehicles out, and this just can't handle them. It doesn't really, it does virtually nothing against a lot of those vehicles. So if you can, back it up with some good AT weapons, and you've got a good use out of it, maybe as an anti-aircraft weapon and anti-infantry deterrent, this vehicle can still be good. But generally, obviously it's going to lack the versatility of like the Crusader 2, not as good against infantry, but it is going to be able to have access to like a upgun, which you can use for diving and killing vehicles. And the Crusader A, you just can't do that. So putting it in the average category right next to his brother, the regular Churchill. Crusaders. This is probably going to shock a lot of people. But I actually think these guys are in the OP category when used correctly. These guys are best used in large numbers. I'm generally using them with the 2-pounder gun until I'm ready to commit to a big push where I want to kill all my opponent's vehicles. Armor training at Vet 1 is super important when you're going to be making the decision to commit to a big push, because Heroic Charge provides speed, acceleration, and rate of fire. But when you get a swarm of like 4 or 5 of these, they're absolutely menacing. Like they will kill anything that's caught out of position or overextended. I think the main issue that players have with these is they tend to lose them because they are fragile. But if you can manage to hit critical mass with these Crusaders, which is easier to do than any other UK Forces vehicle because of their cost, these guys are devastating and way scarier than the equivalent resources spent on, any of these. 5 Crusaders versus 2 archers or 3 archers. Like, I would take the Crusaders anytime because it's much easier to catch out, especially those new Axis heavies, and get behind them and just plug shots into their rear with the high rate of fire of the Crusader gun. I love this tank. It's my favorite tank in the game. I think it's the best. It is relatively low cost. It doesn't have incredible performance against infantry, but it really more than makes up for it with its speed, mobility, and rate of fire. I love the Crusader. I think it's OP, especially in large numbers. So it's staying up there. The truck, I mean, this is the base truck. I don't think there's anything to this. This is the logistic truck. We'll just put both of these in bad because we don't really see these. There's nothing special about them. UK medical truck, decent in team games, especially with the veterancy options. You can do some really nice synergy with light vehicle training where you build actually this standard truck, then you go light vehicle training, and then you upgrade it to the medical variant. It gives you 2 stars of veterancy for doing nothing. And there's some great bonuses that you get from Vet 2. I think it's like reinforced radius, cost, and speed. And when you have this on the front lines, it's really, really nice to use, especially with a lot of your long-range units and just keeping them topped up so they can stay fighting. Having these trucks, I think, is highly underrated, especially for UK. So I'm actually a big fan. Holston, I don't really think this thing is any good right now. I think it requires too much investment, and it's too fragile and susceptible to being caught out when it's in position. It does have like niche use cases where you can use it for anti-aircraft or buttoning enemy vehicles, but for the most part, this isn't really worth the resources. So I'm not really using it. The Dingo. The Dingo is definitely in the strong category. This is the strongest, beefiest, and most dangerous ultralight. It is also the most expensive, so I gotta say that it's probably, while it's the most expensive, it's definitely worth the cost. This thing will chew up 250s in the early game easier than anything else. It's very easy to chase things down. You also get great utility out of it in the early game, especially with the rework to the new 25-pounder for UK forces. The 25-pounder call-in that is accessible to the Dingo, as well as the ability to distribute medical supplies in the early game. This is an incredible unit. I'm almost like this thing is OP, but not. I'd say not quite, because it doesn't scale incredibly. It is good, but yeah, I think it's just kind of at the top of the strong category, not quite an OP. Dingo, yeah, I'm virtually building this in almost every game that I play. It's just too valuable not to have. Great mobility, great damage, great utility. You can't ask for anything more out of an ultralight. So for that, it's going in the strong category. Next, we have the Croc. I actually am putting the Croc in average. Ooh. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but the Croc, it's pretty good at what it does, but honestly, like, dealing with infantry is kind of the least of UK's problems. This does have like a niche use case of like fighting Jaeger blobs. I think it's good for the flamethrower and the effects of pyrotechnics that you get access to. Where is it? Where it's slowing, it's reducing accuracy, it's slowing infantry, all that stuff. That is very good on this. But this thing, because, it's super slow, it's just very susceptible to getting dove. It doesn't really have great self-peel. I am using this on some maps, especially urban maps, where I can properly protect them with like Canadians with Piats. But in general, on open maps, like I'm not getting this. It's just gonna prove to be a big damage sink, and I'm gonna have a really hard time getting a lot of value out of it. Generally speaking, I'm actually going for demolition engineering more often than the Churchill Croc. I don't know if this needs anything in particular to make it better. It is quite strong at what it does. I think it's just with the number of counters that are accessible to Axis to, chew this thing up at long range, like Mortars, 88s, and then all of their heavy tank variants. Like this obviously can't stand up to a KT or a King Tiger. But it is a great anchor vehicle, and as long as you back it up with the appropriate infantry and team weapon force, like anti-tank weapons, then you can usually make some great space with this thing, which is useful for. So, not quite in the strong category for me, probably kind of like at the top of the average category. That takes us to Grants. Grants, I think, kind of expensive for their side tech cost. They are effective, an effective brawler tank. But the main issue with these guys is like they're just kind of a bit outclassed by a lot of the other late game Axis brawlers, like the Panther, for example. The Panther, going toe to toe with the Grants, if you can get tempo and get critical mass of Grants, like they can be very dangerous. They spit out a lot of damage, especially if you can catch out Mortars. Like if you catch out a Mortar, I think it's 2 shots from each cannon will kill a Mortar, which is really nice. Because the Top Gun will actually penetrate the Mortar and other light vehicles. But in general, I tend to lean more towards Crusaders because of their mobility. I have a much easier time fighting some of the super heavies with Crusaders than with the Grants, because the Grants obviously you can't flank with because the main source of their damage is on the front of the vehicle. And that's kind of like the weakness. It's the strength and the weakness. Like the firepower, obviously, it's a good frontline tank. And if you're doing a lot of frontline, like brawling back and forth, exchanging blows with an Axis opponent, it can be good. But just by my playstyle and by preference, I lean more towards the Crusader because of the ability to flank and get behind my opponent and surprise them. And obviously the cost difference. The Grants are quite a bit more expensive than the Crusader as well. So this is a strong tank overall, but I find myself, wanting in a lot of situations harder to use than the Crusader. That takes us to the Humber. This is going to be another contentious take. People are like, oh man, this thing is super fragile, like it's impossible to use. I agree. In a team game setting, the Humber is probably not a great choice unless you're going to go armor battle group and refit it very quickly. In the right hands, these things are terrifying. They are super fast, really difficult to catch, great utility, great damage, and the flares they have access to can really swing the engagements that you need in the mid game to catapult you into tier 4. In the right hands, honestly, this thing is OP. In the right hands. But I also know that it is very fragile. If you snare it, it's almost guaranteed to die. This thing takes a lot of practice and a lot of skill to use properly. So for that reason, I'll put it in the strong category rather than OP. But I love the Humber. I'm a big fan. I talk about this unit a lot. I build it in every single 1v1 or 2v2 that I play. Unless, I'm planning on going for Stuart, which we'll get to. Matilda. Matilda is kind of just a weaker version of the Churchill at the moment. It is slow. It's good anti-infantry damage. But again, I don't feel like anti-infantry capabilities are really the weakness of the UK roster. So I rarely find myself building these. The meta build that I'm seeing a lot for Wehrmacht and also for DAC now with their new anti-tank tools, as well as Wehrmacht meta being focused around tier 2.5 and the access to the Martyrs. I feel like this Matilda probably causes more problems than it solves. Just because of the slow speed, you're not able to dive and adequately kill the units that you want to. But it is another great anchor vehicle. If you don't have access to the Churchill, this is the next best choice. It definitely has a place. But as the game progresses and the Axis get access to their heavier armor variants, the Tigers come out, the Panthers come out, this thing turns out to be a bit more of a liability. And in this situation, I'd usually rather have a Grant because it can get away from those situations faster. Matilda, it's if it gets caught out of position, it's almost guaranteed dead because it's not going to be able to escape. So for that reason, Matilda in the average category. Stuart. Stuart in the right hands, similar sort of situation. This thing could be quite a menace. I think not quite as good as the Humber due to the fact that you need to pay for side tech. But what I've been doing in recent games is building, if I'm side teching into Stuart, I'm building 2. And they really take care of each other. When I'm playing games against a Flak Veerling player from DAC or playing against Whirlwinds or whatever, the Stuarts are really nice and they protect each other very well. The Commander upgrade has very nice utility, although I will say that I feel like the Commander radius needs to be wider. You kind of need to be right next to your units in order to get any use out of the Commander upgrade, which isn't really great. I think it should have a bigger area of effect so you could support units better. But, it's overall quite good. And obviously access to the repair kits, the field repair kits, and the smoke. The survivability package that the Stuart gets is kind of how I like to use it, trying to maximize the uptime and pick off light vehicles or infantry units that are on the flank. These things are decently fast. Access to the tread shot makes them really good for setting up finishing kills from your AT guns. And then also, of course, the benefits of mark target. It may be worthwhile keeping one into the late game if you've built multiple and refitting the other, because the mark target can make killing some of those late game vehicles quite a bit easier. And so for that reason, I'm going to put the Stuart in the strong category. Like I said, in pairs or more, these things are quite dangerous. I think where people start to feel like they're not useful is when you get the side tech and then you only get one, and you can't really be aggressive with them because when there's only one, they can be caught out and killed quite easily. Whereas when there's 2 of them, they kind of have enough damage and cover for each other that they support each other very well when backed by your other forces as well. The Mortar, I don't think this is in a good spot. I'm going to put the Pack Howitzer here too. I'm not going to say a ton about these. I think the Mortar is just very expensive. It comes with the truck, and I just feel like the truck, unless you're going medical truck, in team games this might be decent. But these things are going to get decrewed in the late game by the Axis artillery, and they just don't scale incredibly well. If I'm looking for artillery, I'd much rather have the Bishop. And so I'm generally not going for either of these. The Pack Howitzer is definitely the worst pick. They really messed up the damage profile on this when they nerfed the infantry support gun from DAC because it was getting picked every game. And it's just not strong anymore. It's not worth the cost. And so I'm virtually never going for either of these. Next, we have the BL5. This might sound a little bit weird, but I'm actually going to put the BL5 in average. A lot of people feel like it's bad and it's overpriced. I don't think it's bad. it's probably overpriced. But I think people just kind of get the use of this incorrect. They try to use it the same way that you would use a bishop, like trying to hit frontline units, trying to like, you know, chew up semi-mobile enemy positions. And frankly, just like the time to target for bishop is just a lot better because you can move them around and get them in close. And also the rate of fire is much better on the bishop. The specific use case for the BL5 is honestly when you're playing against Coastal. When you're playing against Coastal and your opponent's building like a bunch of bunkers, this thing is perfect for that. With artillery saturation, which is part of the Indian artillery tree. Here, where do we go? Right here. Where is it? Okay, it's showing both of these. I don't know why. Oh, there we go. The name is wrong. It's called artillery saturation, but it increases the number of shells fired by all on-map artillery and mortar units by 3, and off-map airburst is also firing a couple more shells, as well as perimeter monitor. Really nice. This is much better choice when you're going for artillery than the mortar, especially when you're bishops, but even more so with the BL5. The BL5, I believe it fires either 8 or 9 shells. And with this, it fires between 12 and 13. I got the count a little bit off, so I'm not 100%. But it just makes this thing perfect for dismantling bunkers and other positions. It has a bigger blast radius than the bishop, but like I said, the rate of fire on it is so low that it is really easy for your opponent to start moving out of the threat range after the first shell hits, which is why this is best used against static enemy positions. So if your enemy is building like bunkers or they've got like really concentrated defenses, the BL5 can be a great choice. But in general, like the bishop is much better generalist artillery units, in generally speaking. Next, we have the 25 pounder. This is the base artillery. So this is only usable through recce sections and the dingo. And this is strong. This is a very good ability right now, a very good unit. It is very accurate. It has much better blast radius than it did last patch. If your opponent leaves something to get hit by this that is, I don't know, on your side of the map when you're playing 1v1 or a 2v2, like a smaller map, it's guaranteed to kill it. Like it's guaranteed dead. I'm killing machine guns with this all the time. I've hit some vehicles with it. I've lost a lot of units to it. You cannot ignore this like you could last patch. So it's quite a bit more dangerous now. HMG bunker, it's definitely better now that they reduced the cost on it. Bofors, this thing is bad. I don't even want to talk about like what would fix this because it's I mean, really, you should only be using this to build behind your lines for anti-aircraft purposes, nothing else. I don't generally think building these on the front lines is viable. It's very easy to counter them. They're very susceptible to anti-tank guns or other artillery, and you're just going to end up having burned your resources putting these up. They're okay behind your lines and to defend from aircraft, but I would not consider putting these on the front line as like an anti-infantry defense. At least in higher elo games. If you're lower elo, have some fun with these. But once you start getting into more competitive games, I would not recommend them. Similar situation with the 17 pounder. This is the 17 pounder emplacement variant. It's only available through the Australian battle group. And it is the same as the 17 pounder. It has 360-degree rotation and a decent rotation speed, which is quite nice. But again, this thing very susceptible to artillery strikes, especially to things like the Stuka or double Stuka. It's just very easy to tear these down, and so I can't really recommend them in their current state. But I don't know. We'll see if there's some changes to field defenses by Relic in the upcoming patches. This may move around. Which takes us to, we kind of talked about this in our battle group tier list video. I think in terms of like best battle groups, it's really going to depend on the size of the game that you're playing. if you're playing team games, 3v3s and 4v4s, this is OP. I've talked about this in my last video. I'm not going to go too deep into detail as to why. But otherwise, this is either average or bad. If you're not playing team games like 1v1s, 2v2s, I would not recommend this battle group. The best 3 battle groups, I think, at the moment for a 1v1 and 2v2 situation are Aussies, Canadians, and Armored. There's lots of great tools that really expand the strengths of UK forces in each of these. And then Indian, I think, it's still decently competitive. But these are definitely better choices overall. But like I said, there's still some great stuff in here. The Airburst Barrage, the BL5 can be great against coastals. Gurkhas are very strong. And Volunteer Infantry is a very nice late game economic bonus. And also great for infantry field presence. So overall, pretty good. Anyway, that's kind of the tier list situation. I'm coming up on the 1 hour mark, so I think we'll keep the other commentary a little bit shorter. I talked about abilities a little bit for Indian artillery. I do want to talk a little bit about heavy armor, specifically the abilities in here. And I also want to talk about Canadian shock. So generally, Armored probably has the best, next to Air and Sea. So Air and Sea has the best team game support abilities, but Armor is probably second best in the ability department. When you look at recon artillery and designate targets, both of these are very strong in a team game context, as well as forward repair assembly. The forward repair assembly, obviously the ability to AoE heal your teammates and your vehicles is very nice for a pretty cheap cost compared to how much you would have to pay for engineers to do those repairs. RadioNet is exceptional when you're doing big pushes with a large volume of vehicles. Both of these abilities are good. Prince is obviously great. Churchill. And my favorite personally is Designate Targets at the moment with all of the stealth units that Axis have access to. The extra visibility, and then you combine that with easier to hit and incoming penetration over a very large area. This ability is super spammable in team games and is very useful for your teammates, especially when you're doing attacks or defenses, whatever. I would be like using this constantly because making targets easier to hit means, higher kill potential on enemy infantry. And that it also applies to vehicles, easier to hit the vehicles. And then the extra incoming penetration is going to make it much more possible to kill some of those late game Axis heavy vehicles. When it comes to the Canadian options, I mentioned in 1v1, 2v2s, I'm using Attacking Spirit a lot more often. If it's a very divided map where the battle lines are very drawn and even, I might use Offensive Resupply in combination with some of those recce squads for the consistent 25-pounder base barrages. Map like Crossing in the Woods, this can be very good. Then obviously, I'm pretty much never using Burnout. Incendiary munitions on all of your munitions coming from these infantry units is very nice. I just think Burnout, the opportunity cost for going for that instead of incendiary munitions is not worth it. And then late game smoke operation, I can't understate how good this ability is. Setting up for big pushes on your opponent's heavies or team weapons in combination with Crusaders is just borderline unstoppable. It's really difficult to deal with a large mass of Crusaders in combination with smoke operation. Make sure to bring this into your team games when you're doing big pushes or when your opponent is doing big pushes to deter them. The ability to smoke off their team weapons and potentially isolate some of their heavier vehicles and pick them off is super invaluable, and it's not a very expensive ability. So I just wanted to call out those two as being like super, super useful options, especially when it comes to team games. As far as maps go, so really quickly, not going to talk about the other two battle groups. We kind of went through those pretty extensively in my other video. I do wanted to pull up map pool So really quickly here, just going to swap this out. We'll look at the maps specifically for 1v1s. I just wanted to pick out some maps to let you guys know, like, UK forces' weaknesses is when they are being stretched very thin. They don't have great mobility like DAC or like some of, like Wehrmacht once they get to mid-game. They don't really have great mobility, and mid-game is really the point where you can start to lose. Basically, the gap between your Humber / Stuart and tier 4 is where you are most susceptible. And maps that are very wide with lots of space can make it easier for your opponent to set up big flanks and or pick your units apart. So maps that I'm typically vetoing as UKF in a 1v1 context specifically, Pacino. I think it's too easy to stall out on this map, and it's very difficult to use some of the UK forces' early game light vehicles. And it can be very easy to get flushed out by some tempo builds of like Grenadiers and Pioneers with Flamethrowers and Vet 1, and then some of the DAC options as well. I'm not playing a lot of Pacino. Jebel Pass is kind of difficult as well because of how large it is. This is kind of universally true. DAC is very strong on this map because of how wide it is, and they're super mobile. UK Forces struggles on this map for the opposite reason. They lack the mobility, and they really want to concentrate their forces, and it's just difficult to do on such a big map without giving up too much map control. Langris is very good for UK forces. Crossing in the woods is a little bit dicey because of how far away the natural fuels are from the bases. It can stretch you really thin and make it really difficult if you overcommit to one fuel in the early game that you're not able to secure. And then the game's going to kind of spiral out of control. Faymanville, they're very good on. Semois is actually one of the better maps, even though it's very big. It does have a lot of choke points, which makes it easier to use them. Twin Beaches has kind of the similar problem, but solution at the same time, where it can be very good. Taranto Coastline, Twin Beaches, Villa Fiore all kind of lean into a lot of like line battles. Tunis also very good for UK forces because it's mostly focused on long-range engagements, and there's lots of cover to make great use of Tommies. And there's also lots of space to make use of Crusaders for flanking and whatnot. So generally speaking, if I'm thinking about vetoes for UK forces specifically, probably Jebel Pass, Pacino. Angeville is a little bit more difficult to use UK forces on because of the cutoffs, and they have a harder time on the right side of the map in the early game. And Crossing in the Woods are probably some of the more difficult maps to play with UK forces. Anyway, we're up over the 1 hour mark. I don't want to nerd out too much, but I hope you guys learned something. I hope you enjoyed the content. Just going to pull back and give you guys another glance here at the tier list. Again, these are my opinions. You know, they're kind of subject to the way that I play the game, but I think UK forces in general right now I think they're just universally probably the stronger allied faction. They have lots of tools that cover pretty much everything that you could possibly need. Their weakest point is probably the mid game, where Axis tier 2.5 starts to come alive for both DAC and for Wehrmacht. They don't have great answers to that outside of like just massing AT guns and waiting for tier 4. But outside of that, like very strong early game, very strong late game options. I think just properly executed, these guys are UK forces just very, very strong right now. So I hope you guys learned something. Please, comment down below what else you would like to see. In terms of faction overview stuff as well, if you feel like there's material that I'm missing that you'd like me to dive into, I'm happy to do that. Please don't forget, go and check out my other how-to battle group videos that dives a lot more into the intricate mechanics and really situational things that you're facing as you play with each of these factions and battle groups. But I did want to provide like a broad overview of their unit suite, the battle group options, etc. for everybody. I know there's a lot of new people coming into the game and a lot of old players that are coming back and don't have experience with the new meta. So hopefully this was refreshing for you. And if you guys stuck around for the whole hour and 10 minutes of me yapping, then I really appreciate you guys. You guys are awesome. That's it for this one. See you, nerds.